like we've seen like with colonial times is really antiquated, clearly has had a whole host of problems. Now you're seeing like these open digital communities where anyone can come and go at will, and it's by choice. Like I didn't you were born in the US, that's something that you didn't control. Here, you can definitely control the filter that you have on, the punk that you bought, the board ape, and the choice of one versus the other or multiples when you stack your identity is really powerful. And so
The Collectors. Hosted by Stashh.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 1 of The Collectors, which is a new podcast series we're doing hosted by the Stashh team, specifically by myself, Tor, and MC Liquid. We're going to be diving deep into the NFT and metaverse space. We're going to be bringing in the biggest brains to talk about the biggest topics in the NFT space, things that have been trends, will be trends someday in the future. And who better to talk to than the people who are responsible for some of the adoption today and responsible for some of those huge trends. We'll do some episodes with those special guests. We're going to do some episodes where we'll go into the news from the NFT space. Today, though, with episode 1, we're delighted to be bringing in someone I really respect as our very first special guest of the Collectors podcast, and I'm pretty sure a big collector himself. Please welcome Santiago R Santos. It's a pleasure to have you.
thank you guys for having me. I'm really excited to go into this discussion. Honored
Right
to
on.
be also the first guest, so I don't know if I'll live up to it, but I'll set the bar really low so that future guests can just like make it much better episodes.
Yeah, either we're going to retire after this and never try again, or this is going to be the rough draft that helps define all future episodes. So either way,
Yeah.
it feels like a good deal for you.
Yes.
Excited to have you on, Santi. Just kicking off to warm things up a little bit. Maybe you could just tell us a sort of a top line on your background, how you got got involved into crypto, and maybe a little bit, obviously the NFT space. Just around and give everybody a sort of a background on you.
Yeah. So I studied game theory, and from that perspective, discovered Bitcoin in 2012, and it was just fascinating. It was so eye opening, and I grew up in Mexico, and so kind of like the remittance use case of being able to move money cross borders felt really strong, very compelling, still does to this day. And over the years, obviously, was lucky enough to be part of and invest. I'm an investor, and so I just kind of focused on investing in early stage projects. Um, Quickly gravitated to Ethereum, and none of this was like obvious. I think a lot of people like to say that it was. It wasn't for me, at least in my journey. And I've been in space for so many years, and I still like to remind myself, like I'm a student of history, and I like to remind myself that it's really hard to predict the future. At least for me, like the internet was like so hard in 2002. There were so many skeptics back then, and being able to like predict smartphones and everything that happened was just like I think like there was very few people that were able to do that. Um, and so like I say this because I think like so many people like imagine the NFT use case, for instance, when Ethereum got started and like you saw crypto kitties, like people were very skeptical of NFTs then and there. It wasn't that like people don't like collecting, it was just so much that the tech wasn't there yet. And so I think it's been a fascinating journey. I mean, I won't go into a lot of details. I was a ParaFi, I was early in DeFi, and over time, I became very interested in the NFT use case. One, I love collecting. I don't consider collecting an investing sport for me. It's just something that I feel really passionately about. But I do think that like the NFT space today is so nascent, but I think is will probably be explosive in the number of use cases because art is just one very small piece of what NFTs can be. And it just broadly speaking, like permeates into other things more like what does it mean to have a digital identity and people appreciating having digital ownership and agency and applying the same things of what it's not just art, it could be contracts of any sort. And so I'm just really excited. I think we're very early still in the space, and it does feel like, I've seen like 4 cycles now, 3 4 and I just think like if you're leaving right now, it's like we're finally entering a stage where crypto is being used in a very meaningful way, and that's very exciting.
Yeah, I would say that this being obviously not our first cycle either, there's some bottom signs that you can recognize, and one of those is people heading for the door tends to be a bottom signal. Like everybody who joined in 2021 because it was hot, when they leave, it's good to show up. That's always how it works. We're going to get into everything you said. We've got questions about identity. We've got questions about these use cases beyond, strictly images. I want to just click on one thing you said, which was that you started with game theory, and I started with game theory. That was my concentration during my undergrad work, was game theory, auction theory, all of that stuff. I'm curious, like, where do you see that playing a role, like in NFTs specifically? Are you really drawn to those projects that have like really interesting gamified elements to them that are trying to do something really experimental from an economics perspective?
Mhm. That's a good question. Like, I think like there's a lot of different experiments happening live in crypto of like auctions, how you think about whitelists and open or closed and having a time limit. And so it's really fascinating. Like
Right.
you're just seeing all these experiments in real time, and you have to have money involved. You have to have value transacted for people to actually participate in these experiments. And so I used to joke with my economics. I still write to them and say, guys, I don't care if you don't like crypto, like if you don't like Bitcoin or Ethereum, but like unequivocally, tell me if there's a more exciting field to study and put into practice certain theories. And I can't think of one. This is like the best experiment for anyone that's interested in game theory. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, and public and private bidding. Those are all like features that we
Yeah,
tried to build early into Stashh because it was expanding the design space. Like the design space is really where I get excited. It's
yeah,
like we've barely scratched the surface. On the other hand, I know there's challenges going back and selling to institutions. Hey, check out this cool, interesting thing. It's an experiment. We don't know how it's going to go. We don't know if that's really adoption. It's obviously
mhm,
interesting, but are we
yeah,
ready to really sell it as adoption?
yeah. I think just on this point, do want to say something. Like you know what I mean, like over the last 10 years, 12 years, Bitcoin as a system of like transacting money has been fairly interesting. Like that experiment is fascinating that it continues to exist. Um, but it's like, what else can we do now? Okay, it worked for one specific use case. This idea of like creating systems that like are better at coordinating, um, and like gamifying and producing a whole set of incentives and produce a certain outcome. Like that could be applied to so many other things. And I think that's where you talk about the design space. Like, okay, we can probably start thinking about healthcare, which has a whole set of incentive problems. We can think about education and so many other things. Of course, people that are listening and have been around in like 2017, like I've heard this narrative before. There's so many companies that have tried to do this. But again, it's like it was like the internet, like so many things were tried, pets.com in 1999 didn't work. But then, you had Petco and you have other companies that, because the infrastructure does change and does evolve very quickly, and especially in crypto. So, I think part of the thinking now is what are the things that have been explored, tried before in crypto that didn't work, but are probably going to work when you think about like, okay, there's L2s, there's more, the infrastructure is just far more advanced than it was. And NFTs is a prime example of that. Compare Cool Cats to, Bored Apes and other things today. It's like night and day.
For sure. Well, that seems like a good time then to get into the question of identity,
Mm.
right? Because that's one of these use cases that is more based on like the modern infrastructure and is another interesting use case, for that exact kind of experimentation. And I know, MC, this is something you're passionate about too.
Yeah, actually, it is, and it even, I think it wasn't even really. You're gonna have to excuse a little bit of background noise, but what really kind of kicked me off in this direction is one of you. I'm sure you're aware of Balaji Srinivasan, and he started many years ago, actually, I think 5-7 years ago, about the whole pseudonymous economy and how we're going to have by default, we're going to have our real life identity and then our online identity, which would be some sort of pseudonym, and how you do that, either whether it's for safety, privacy, or some level of security. So I think this is taken on sort of a more fun angle with the whole NFTs, the PFP projects. I think punks are one of the first OGs with the PFP project, and subsequently the BAYC. I think it's appropriate, given that you have your own punk, and I'm actually a big fan of 6529. I see the
Mm.
similarities between between your punks. How does that represent you, or how did that kick you down that path? And where do you see it going from here?
It was a very subtle awakening for me in understanding the power of identity. Like I minted some punks and then I purposely bought this punk because I felt that hoodies were, it just spoke to me. This hacker culture is, exactly. And I thought, I have a beard and glasses. And so it took me a time to like decide which one was going to be my profile, if you will. But I do think it's over time, I just sort of one day just was like, okay, I don't think I don't think I'll ever be able to sell this punk because it's tied to just me and who I am. And I think, in many ways, I do think that like people really like the ability to create an identity that sort of like is not tied to the color of your skin, religion, other like very like different um like characteristics that are like by birth or just by whatever. And I think the power here that I don't know if a lot of people realize this, but at least for me, I do think that like it's kind of really nice to just not think about these things. And I think as humans we constantly like to judge, or consciously or subconsciously you're going to make an impression of someone in the first like minute that you interact with them, right? So Tor, I can see you, but MC, you have like this sort of mask or like Snapchat filter. And so I actually like more your like, because I just know that my brain is going to want to make like a certain assumption of like who you are because maybe you remind me of someone else. And I think like one of the more powerful things that I've tried to put into practice is like delaying judgment. And I think in this culture of crypto where you're interacting in these open source systems and communities that you may have never met these people in real life, um, but you just like tend to place focus in where I think matters most, which is like judging a person by their ideas and their execution and putting aside other variables and parameters that kind of don't really matter that much. And like you look at these studies, it matters, right? People that are on average, like people make more money if they're taller, like dumb shit like this, the color of their skin still matters. Like, and so I think in a perfect world, I think we're moving more towards a system where, people are valued and appreciated for their ideas and the execution of that. And you put aside all other things. And in a more optimistic case, like we move to I guess like a more egalitarian, more, you know, fair, systems.
So these are tools, right? Like we're talking about these super complex ideas like identity and accountability and meritocracies, and
Mhm.
NFTs are just tools. So this punk is one of your tools in your toolbox. Has it been effective at establishing? You're saying like now you could never sell it. Do you feel like it's
Yeah.
been an effective identity for you? Do you feel like it helps people move past assumptions they might make about you?
I still think they make them, right? It's like, okay, this
Mm,
person was able to drop X amount of money and it's public
mm,
record.
right.
And so they're going to judge me because of that. It's like, oh, you're flexing. It's the same way why people want to wear like an expensive watch. It's a valid argument. I'm not saying it's not true.
Sure.
I didn't do it for that reason, but I could see someone being critical of that. Um, and so I guess it just puts more into question like how these different NFT collections have been released. Like,
Hmm.
is it, there's only 10,000 of bored apes. Is that going to be enough? Like, and I think it starts with this concept that crypto since inception has been really about scarcity that drives value. You think about Bitcoin, there's 21 million Bitcoin. It's sort of a sacrosanct concept. We think about, monetary policies of these networks, and scarcity is a big component of that. But I think
Yeah.
we should probably just like invert that thinking and say, no, it's abundance that is going to be the most important thing for these NFT collections, right? If you want to have, a billion people have an NFT, well, we should start thinking about abundance, not scarcity. And I think that ultimately utility will drive value. And so, um, yeah, it's interesting. I think that I haven't seen that many projects think about this. Maybe like Open Mint,
I've
but
got
yeah,
one. I got an obvious one, Reddit.
really. Oh well, yeah, there we go.
Yeah, but I mean, again, that's so early. But they're layering it on top of an existing social platform. So it remains to be seen. Like, do people value that they now have a new extension of an already established identity, as opposed to taking a punk as a blank slate and trying to imbue that with some kind of an identity that they're going to build over time based on their actions, based on their reputation. It's two completely different models.
Absolutely. And to be fair, look, I didn't buy this. Like, is my identity totally latched onto this punk? No, but like, do I like it? Absolutely. Is it recognizable? Yes. Like, and so, I think it's a fun process for me. I don't consider it investing. It's just like, it's almost like you go to your house, you open your wardrobe, and you see all these things that, humans love collecting, and it's a part of our identity. And now people are realizing, okay, for the first time ever, we have this ability to curate and create like digital identity backed by provable scarcity. And I think that concept people start appreciating more and more over time. And then it's like, wow, there's just so much to do because it's just an open canvas.
Yeah,
We're gonna
sorry.
go ahead, man.
I just want to jump in. I mean, I think what we're exploring here is it's just multifaceted. I mean, we're talking about a singular identity, whether it's a punk or if it's MC Liquid, but I think where we will start to rapidly go as people, just like maybe we used to anyway, used to wear a suit and tie to work, or we'd wear different casual clothes. We would represent different parts of ourselves in different contexts, and I think this is going to be in evolution online, where you'll have these different facets, whether it's a visual identity that under this context I'm this person, or under that context I'm another person, while also exploring what these, I mean, because NFTs, I think we're speaking very narrowly, and we know it's as broad. We're just scratching the surface of it, and what these collections, as collectors, what these things will represent, and how they represent who we are, and the complexity of who we are, which has actually been abstract up until now. I think we're now starting to turn these abstract notions into tangibles, and I think that's where there's a huge mind flip, and I think it's endless. It's an endless topic.
Yeah, before we get into, because what you're starting to bring up, MC, is what I want to get to in a second, which is this idea of not only individual identity but collective identity, and the idea of DAOs, or these PFP projects that are now allowing for very complex collective identities to emerge. But just before we get there, I wanted to talk about something else that, Santi, you've actually raised on other podcasts, and it was part of the reason why we were really excited to have you on, is because you've talked about something that is very linked to identity, which is privacy, the ability to sort of selectively disclose ideas about yourself or pieces of your identity to different people in different contexts. That cypherpunk ideal of being able to selectively reveal oneself to the world, that is privacy. But to this point in the space, it might be the single most underexplored facet of NFTs, and it's probably our number one focus at Stashh in expanding the design spaces. We try to bring privacy by default for NFTs because we see them being used for identity. We see them being used for community building and reputation. It makes me really nervous to think we're heading into a world where all of that is completely transparent by design, and the consequences that might have for identity. It's a complex topic, to be sure, because it's also linked to these concepts of accountability and this idea of meritocracy and egalitarianism that you were bringing up. But just talk to me about how you think privacy and NFTs are part of the conversation. Like, how are they part of that same conversation to you?
Yeah, well, I totally agree with you. I think privacy is a fundamental right that we should have, and we're seeing the effects of that and the drawbacks of that, right? And in the real world, and so I think for crypto to reach mainstream, we need to have more privacy preserving solutions that are elegant in what you disclose, and having that ability to selectively share information, whether it's zero knowledge proofs or what have you. I mean, zero knowledge proofs have been sort of like the holy grail and one of the more exciting pieces since the beginning of crypto, right, or the space. But we're not there yet. We'll probably get there. I think we will. It's just a matter of time. NFTs, it's an interesting question because it just depends, right? I think some people want to be very vocal and public about, hey, I bought a Bored Ape and I want to be part of this community and I want to showcase that, and it's flexing and it's fine. Like, whereas, when you think about an NFT, like your broadly speaking, your digital identity, like all your history that is on chain, like most definitely not. You wouldn't want people to know that, right? Maybe you want to selectively create a proof that can attest to the fact that you've never been liquidated and that you're a good creditor, like that you're a good borrower, and you get a lower rate, like we talk about, like in the context of DeFi. Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, I think like DeFi, one of the biggest criticisms is capital efficiency. So can we do under collateralized loans? Well, yeah, maybe you can create a NFT that is attesting to your KYC AML status, but doesn't disclose exactly where you live or exactly what your age and other, personally identifiable information. So I agree with you, Tor. I mean, I think it's where you guys are focusing on is probably one of the more unexplored areas that will really open up the different use cases of NFTs just beyond a profile picture, because a profile picture by design is meant to be public. But there's so
Sure.
many other different use cases that are possible but require
I
privacy.
and I agree with that as well. Like the use case that has gotten the most traction with collectors, with consumers, is definitely being able to show off their ownership. And I have no problem with that, especially since it is such a human drive to collect, to display, to show. These social proofs that we create and that we consume are super important. But we're setting people up for a world in which they think, an NFT means I have to dox all of my past, present, and future through this address. There's no
Yeah.
process of selectively revealing. There's no aspect of I'm going to flex this Bored Ape, but the other 20 NFTs in my wallet or the thing I buy tomorrow, that's private information until I choose to disclose it. We're definitely embracing sort of that private by default model. The consequences are mostly in UX, right? How do you obfuscate that from the user so that it
Yeah.
feels as fun as a Web 2 application? And again, like if we or anybody else can pull that off, now we have the best of both worlds. But if people sort of say, we're gonna punt privacy because users only care about the user experience, they only care about how much money they're going to make, they only care about flexing, we're doing the user a disservice. They kind of get this stuff. I just want
Yeah.
them, we all want them to understand it before it's bad for them, before they click the wrong link and everything in their wallet is gone, before they
Yeah.
realize they've made themselves a target just because of what they own.
Yeah, I mean, and look, if you're a marketer listening to this, you're like, no, 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 wait, please don't build this, right? Because for them, it's like, imagine if you're a punk, you walk into a store, you scan a QR code. People love getting free stuff, and so, I'm gonna get like, you walk into, whatever store, you scan the QR code, you get dropped an NFT. By default, you're already doxing yourself. They already know your wallet, and if you only have one wallet, which we assume most people mainstream will just have one wallet,
Yeah.
not like 100 wallets, then it's like the holy grail. Forget about cookies. They just saw your entire purchasing history. They can profile you in so many different ways, and it's like the best marketing toolkit that you can ever have. And so, I think certain jurisdictions are going to take object to that, particularly in the EU. And so, yeah, I think it's very important what you just said, which is it must be by default. Because if it's not
Mhm.
by default, people are not going to, people don't really realize that when they're using these free social tools, you're getting a lot of, there's a cost to that.
Oh yeah, always a cost. And we talk about Web3 being a more user-centric economy. Nothing could be less user-centric than making them back into the product and allowing them to capture none of that. Again, back to economics, right? All producers surplus, no consumer
Hmm.
surplus. Without privacy, it really does become sort of an extractive space as opposed to creating collective value. So on that, I collective value, right? That takes me to DAOs. And that's another place that I know, MC, you've talked a lot about DAOs and how they're impacting the future of collecting.
Yeah, maybe you can just give us. I mean, I'll be frank. I only know PleasrDAO just by reputation of that it's sort of a buzzy. They're very buzzy and very active in the space. But maybe you can give a little bit of background how they came to be and what your involvement in PleasrDAO and how you think they may be driving the space forward.
Yeah, it started very simply as there were a few people that wanted to buy People Pleaser, which is a great artist that had done work with a bunch of DeFi projects, and she had done a great video on Uniswap V3's launch, and it was like a very cool unicorn with like it was just a great video. And we banded together because we said, hey, we're gonna outbid each other, and instead of one winning, let's just create a DAO, so that all 20 degens of us can just share a piece of this video, and buy it together. And it was very simple. It just true to the nature and the power of DAOs. Like we were able to, create, a multi-sig and fund within 5 minutes while the auction was happening. And that was the inception of PleasrDAO. And it was people, we knew kind of all of us kind of knew each other. And then it kind of grew into something much, much more, which is now perhaps one of the largest. There's Flamingo DAO, there's other great DAOs out there. PleasrDAO, I think I would consider it in that category. I think we've curated a very important piece of internet Web3 culture. That quickly became sort of the ethos of, hey, let's actually go out there and buy certain pieces that we think are iconic and very representative of the ethos of the space. For example, we bought Snowden's One of One. It's a beautiful NFT that has his face kind of like, and the text behind it that creates this face with different shadings, is the court ruling that like ruled in favor of like privacy and surveillance and all this stuff. So again, really, I think one of the more important like NFTs. And we ended up buying the Tor Foundation's piece that was created by this great artist called IX Shells of distributed like like AI art. So it was really cool. And again, privacy is a fundamental right, and Tor browser is really important in that front. And so
I'm sensing a theme. Yes.
Yeah, so there's like a theme right attached to that. We've expanded the number of members and over time. We've bought the Doge meme, and so there's a few initiatives there that that's pretty cool. My involvement in that was as part of the first 20 or so members, and then I was on the council for a long time to kind of determine, really just set the direction of the DAO. What were the things, the pieces of art, the NFTs that we wanted to collect? We bought the Wu-Tang album, which was an interesting experiment of how a DAO can go out and buy physical stuff, not just digital. And so that, I think, when we talk about real world assets and how this digital world can actually become part in the real world, was a good experiment. And so it's been a fascinating journey. I'm less involved now, but I do think it's still a great community and like-minded individuals that we share a very specific kind of goal and understanding that we want to be that DAO that preserves and collects like iconic pieces. Maybe not the most, but certainly the most iconic like pieces that speak to kind of the space and what it stands for.
Sorry, just jump in on that. I noticed you were part of that purchase for the Wikipedia's.
Oh
I
yeah.
think the Hello World. What led you to that? And do you?
Mhm.
Because I was trying to wrap my head around it. I had mixed feelings about the founder, especially now in our sort of peak woke culture. But like, how did you get to that? Like, hey, this is a piece of history. And do you
Mhm.
feel it still holds the same value, or if anything, it's increased in value? Like, what's your view
Mhm.
on that? Since then.
So I bought that personally, and then I contributed to the DAO, and because I had to, it was just more structural than anything. Um, for me, Wikipedia was the open sourcing of knowledge. Before Wikipedia, I remember growing up as a kid, and you had to buy Encarta every year, the encyclopedia. You know what I mean? Like you had to buy the CD, and it was expensive. It was like 80 bucks. It was a lot of money. And then you could also buy the Britannica, which is like this massive set of. It was beautiful, right? But it was expensive, and you had to update it every year. And like, I didn't have the money at the time, like to buy this. I had to go to a library, I guess.
Yeah, it was knowledge as a service. It was a hell of a
You know what I
model.
mean? Yeah, exactly. And Wikipedia has gone through a very interesting transition too, where initially it wasn't like you could have you wouldn't have been able to cite Wikipedia as a source in school. You'd have been like immediately left out of the room. And now it's just become a prevailing kind of source of truth because it's okay. There's issues with mods and how these things get censored and totally get like it's not a perfect model, but at least the ability to catch up with the knowledge that's being created in the space and documenting that in a public registry in an open source, much more open source manner, really speaks to, I think, broadly speaking, how, given the choice of open versus closed systems, open systems will always win and prevail over time. And you just have to, I think for me, that was why it became relevant in the sense of crypto as an open source collective and network. Um, and and also the perception of it was also important, right? Being from, no, this is not established source of knowledge, to actually it is. And so regarding the founder and whether it's preserve value, it's an important question because I mentioned this before, but when I collect, I don't think of it from a return perspective. I don't collect thinking that I'm going to ever sell. And I haven't sold any of my punks. I haven't sold any. I collect other stuff. I collect rare Harry Potter books. I love Harry Potter, and I think I'm the largest collector in the world at this point. But I'm not thinking of selling. I'm just thinking of, I want to preserve this and be a good collector. Maybe the real question is, what does it mean? Are you a collector or are you a speculator? And I think the true definition of a collector is, I'm doing this because I want to I want to house this and preserve it in the best way possible, and also showcase it to other people, not just put it in a warehouse. Because I do think that like collecting is a sport. Going to museums is a big part of culture, and allowing people to see things um, is how I think of myself as a collector. Not, I'm gonna like hoard all these things and not let anyone see them or touch them. And so, so yeah, I don't know if it's, I just wanted to bid to win. And obviously there's finite resources, of course, but we did have like a price in mind, and it just sort of was below that price target. And yeah, we ended up buying a cool NFT and the ability to interact with the founder and edit the initial entry of Wikipedia, which was Hello World, and also got this cool raspberry color Mac computer, which I don't know, I love that machine. I grew up with one of those, and so yeah, it was really cool.
That's awesome. And also, of course, we're now going to ask this question in perpetuity to all future guests of the Collectors. What is a collector? Since you
Yeah.
answered it from your own personal, very eloquent perspective, I'll be interested to see how many people sort of agree with that sentiment, because clearly some people collect things because they want to establish what they've bought as a portion of their own identity, or because they are not necessarily speculators, but they see undervalued items and they want to preserve those items, not necessarily in the sense that they feel a moral obligation or a personal obligation, but they just think that if they preserve it, then in the future, when its value is properly valued or properly valued by another person or buyer, that maybe there's some money in it. So some people have very different perspectives. I'd say the NFT space as it currently stands kind of serves all comers equally, but based on how it's talked about, we hear a lot more about the speculator version of the collector, as opposed to what you're really describing from your own personal ethos, which is, I just want to preserve this and make sure that this historical thing remains a part not only of history, but of the future.
Mhm. It's a great question. Like, what does it mean to be a collector? And B, at what point do you give up the collection? Because I think there's a natural evolution where you part with things, and it's fine. It's okay. It's like, I don't have a good answer to that. Like, because we obviously have evolved like this emotional attachment to things that we collect. But there comes, I think, a natural point in time where you let it go. And for me, I think the answer to that, which I don't really have a perfect answer to that because I clearly struggle with letting things go, is, or things that I collect, is I feel like when you think that a better person can take care of it better, yeah, it is kind of a natural. So I'll give you an example. I sold like a nifty island like NFT, and there was just someone in the community that really was a part of the community, really wanted it, and like reached out to me and said, "Do you want to sell it?" I'm like, "Well, it was a gift. I didn't even buy this. Like, you don't sell gifts." And he's like, and then I talked to the founder, and he said, "No, this guy is really involved in the community. He really wants this NFT. It's all he thinks about. It's all he." I was like, "Okay." At that point, I said, "This is a person that is going to take care of this NFT in a much better way than I will." And so that was perhaps one of the few examples where I've sold an NFT.
That's interesting. I mean, I love that, but it also gets back to this idea of utility. And sometimes NFTs, when we say like they've got utility, to me, that's still squishy, right? But if anyone
Yeah.
feels that an NFT has utility, well, then it does. If they feel an emotional compulsion to interact with it or expand it or something, what you're talking about, these open permissionless systems let you do it. And if somebody else wants to own it so that they can make that expansion, so they can take and expand that utility, that's what they have the opportunity to do, provided they can acquire it. Or even if they can't acquire it, they can build a utility that allows anybody who does own it, or whatever other parameter they set. It's that idea of stacking the blocks on top of the blocks,
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
ever expanding Legos. That's not just a DeFi thing. Like, clearly that's an NFT thing as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Utility is a very interesting concept because it can take so many different forms, right? And obviously, a lot of NFT collections think about we're going to build all this utility, we're going to build a metaverse, and it's like, well, guys, like, no, like, can you just accept the fact that it's a nice PFP, and that has a lot of utility in and of itself. And so I think a lot of projects that I see now are in this really going to struggle with their kind of identity, right? What I like about punks,
Mhm.
as an example, is they don't pretend to be anything other than just art, and a digital, like a very historical record artifact of one of the earliest pieces
Mhm.
um, of crypto art. And so that's it. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. And when you have that, I think it attracts a certain kind of collector that just says it's very, you don't pretend to be many things, and it has a very strong kind of reason of existence, and it doesn't pretend to be other things that it's not. And so I think, unfortunately, a lot of collections are just going to struggle with this over time and learn that they're trying to like be something and try to be many things for many
Right.
people, and I don't think that builds a lot of utility over time.
Which takes me
Actually,
back. Oh, go ahead, man.
yeah, I have to add to that because this is going deep very quickly, and I love this. Um, I have to. I always reference him because I really think he's been eloquent in how he's framed it. And NFT themselves is essentially a cultural. It's a bucket that obviously whatever you put into it. I think right now its first use case is a cultural bucket, so we're attaching it to different items of culture, and that the NFT, the technology, is it's almost like he says it's a mimetic rail, so it's allowing us to transfer culture on the speed of which we've never been able to do before. So it's actually we're still trying to wrap our heads around how to grasp it, but I think the profundity and the exponential of what it is we're creating is like you said, it doesn't. We're almost trying to make it abstracted away from more than just the core essence of what it is, right? It's just this bucket of whatever we attach to it. Um, what are your thoughts on maybe the how we will, because it's happening so fast we can barely grasp. What are your thoughts on where we're going with that as a concept?
I think you bring up a fantastic point, which is mimetic culture, desire, and how we're leveraging the distribution of the internet, and these concepts and ideas just are spreading at a rate we've never seen before. And I think one, I think is true too. Um, you know, well, we can take this in many ways, right? One, like, are we creating like these digital nations? And Balaji talks a lot about that in his latest book, and I think it's a fascinating concept. Like, it initially feels and sounds really out there, but it's like when you think about it, and he frames that as like, wait, most nations, like most companies are already bigger than most countries that are recognized in the United Nations, and then most countries, the GDP of these countries like is like really small, and like, can we have a digital nation that transcends like like nationalism, and the concept of nationalism is kind of really antiquated. Man-made boundaries, like we've seen, like with colonial times, is really antiquated. Clearly, has had a whole host of problems. Now you're seeing like these open digital communities where anyone can come and go at will, and it's by choice. Like, I didn't. You were born in the U.S. That's something that you didn't control. Here, you can definitely control the filter that you have on, the punk that you bought, the board ape, and the choice of one versus the other or multiples when you stack your identity is really powerful. And so And the second thing that you can really just kind of go down a rabbit hole is like, okay, this idea of like speculation, Tor, that you brought up, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, candidly. Like a lot of people consider that to be like the dirty side of crypto. We're not supposed to talk about speculation. It's a bad thing. It's like, well, is it really? Like I can't think of any like big technological any big revolution like railroad industry, like the gold rush and all these things. Like speculation is a big part of like who we are as humans. Like we like to speculate. We like to like it's a thing, right? And so crypto delivers a lot of entertainment and mimetic value. Like and like I'm not saying that's the only thing that it provides, but it's a big part of it. And the more we recognize it, that it's a big part of the movement, then I think the better off we'll be, because we just need to be like comfortable with that. I think, like, of course there's like bad problems attached to that.
Right.
I don't think anyone should be like leveraging long and like, you know, putting their house as collateral to go and buy like speculative NFTs. No, I mean, that's obviously like an extreme of speculation, but I'd be like, I think it'd be disingenuous to think that like we're doing things because without speculation in mind. I think there's always an element of speculation.
We're not saying that everybody does things altruistically in the crypto space. I would be probably the first person to accuse anyone of that.
Certainly not effective altruism either.
Oh yeah, which was we won't go too far down that.
It's a big facade, yeah. Anyways.
Yeah, well, that's actually going to be part of the point I want to raise, right? Which is like, look, a lot of this culture that we're talking about, the big shift that I'm seeing, you know, like, because we can talk about self-sovereignty and things like that, but like really, to me, it's a very simple inversion from top down to bottom up. We have top down culture that comes from Disney or from, you know, influential people within government institutions. We have the powers that be, and they influence top down and they disseminate culture top down through rails that ultimately they capitalize and control. And then there's bottom up, where collections of people organically orient themselves around new pieces of culture. Like Dogecoin was not really sold to us top down, at least certainly not initially. It had to emerge organically from something. Nothing that stupid would ever be sold top down to us. How could it possibly? But it, you know, it succeeded in its own way. Mimetically, it succeeded in its own way. Where we reach this dangerous inflection point, and something that I don't think there's enough education about, and there's not enough understanding of, is at what point does capitalism do the thing it always does, where something that appears to be bottom up has actually been co-opted, and now Bored Apes are at the Super Bowl, or, you know, like this thing that we thought was really this cool organic NFT community was Coca-Cola putting people into the community, and like eventually they start putting out these suspicious polar bear NFTs that look really familiar around Christmas, and it's gonna happen sort of suddenly and then all at once. That's my concern. Is like, so how, if there is this kind of ethos that exists in the NFT space, speculation or collection or whatever otherwise, but if there's this ethos of bottom up, if there's this ethos of organic culture and these mimetic rails that are more democratic, how can we protect those rails, and how are we going to know if they're already being co-opted in a way that could put at risk the potential benefit to society of having more democratic rails for culture?
Well, I guess you have to wonder, there's always been the possibility to have this bottoms up emergence of culture. There's nothing new that crypto, I guess the question is, what is new this time? Because bottom up culture movements have been a part of history. When you look at the, you know, for instance, like certain movements like, you know, against slavery, against, you know, advocating for gay rights and gender equality, and all these things I think were like bottoms up movements and revolution. Like they started.
They had to be.
They had to be. Exactly. And so the question is like, what does crypto uniquely enable now that can, to your point, maybe preserve that bottoms up element, that grassrooty feeling that I think is so very powerful.
But there's one really, not to cut you off, but there's one important difference between those movements that you're mentioning, like civil rights movement, like ending slavery, women's rights movements. These were pretty distinctly like anti-capitalist movements, because you abolish slavery and suddenly like, there was no way to slot that back into like, oh, actually we've co-opted this and capitalism loves this now. It was bloody and it was contentious because you were trying to break the system itself. So of course that bottoms up was the only way that it could be done. what I'm worried about with NFTs specifically is like, there is this bottom up, just, you can expand the whole thing to crypto in general, right? The bottoms up culture of Bitcoin, you know, like it was disrupting a very lucrative existing system. I'm more worried about NFTs failing this test because they can easily be co-opted into an existing system of speculation and cultural influence. And so the question is like, is that already happening? Is that such an awful thing? Or is there something really holy here that needs to be protected? Is crypto somehow, you're asking it yourself, is crypto somehow different and special?
Well, let's take the example of Disney, for example. Like Disney has gone to, and look at the most recent films, they certainly move in a direction where they've been listening to cultural trends, for sure, I think. Just in terms of the characters, the color of the skin of the different characters is changing. The different themes, like Encanto, is very much skewed towards the Hispanic population, just becoming a more important piece of, you know, in the United States at least. And so I think sometimes we can be too caught up in, okay, what are we going towards? Like, do you want to destroy Disney as it stands, or would like, which is totally fine. I get it. Do you want to create a decentralized, like organic Disney, or an entertainment like Hollywood that exports culture across the world? But I think the more perhaps viable path here is that you're going to change these institutions because they feel pressure that in order to stay relevant in this world, they're just going to have to adopt and change the way that they operate. Otherwise, you're going to have this innovator's dilemma, or they're going to be blown out of the water. They're going to cease to exist. Why? Because there is a transfer of power inherently from too centralized to more decentralized. But it's a spectrum. It's never like a binary state. Like a true decentralized system, I think, is no better off than a truly centralized system. Like nothing gets done in a true decentralized system, and things break in a centralized system. And so I think, now again, of course, like in crypto culture, there have been movements where this maximalism approach of like, it has to be totally decentralized. I mean, first of all, I don't think there's a system that is totally decentralized. But when you take the practical approach, I think here, the best outcome that I think I would be actually content with is, what is that outcome do you be happy with? What I would be happy with an outcome is where Disney can start creating content that may emerge from a DAO like StoryDAO. You know, that is, there's all these freelance, independent content creators that never get discovered because they don't work at Disney. But they can now form a collective, start creating this really nice content, and then maybe have the option to sell it to Disney or work with Netflix or work with Amazon. But they have much more bargaining power when they're able to like form this collective, and a DAO that, you know, if you will. And so I think it's a very fascinating experiment, but it's this idea of, it's just a bit of a transfer of power. And when these institutions that have historically exported and dominated culture and the narrative feel that, then I think they're going to have to adapt and respond. And I think that would be a great outcome.
Yeah, actually, I would love to add to that, because I think what we have now is reflexivity in sort of the major distributors, right? And they're sort of the power that they have is starting to wane, in that because of provenance and relevance, basically everything that, because of the mimetic nature of what we're doing, it can be sourced back to the original idea, and then it grows organically, whether it's co-opted or not. If and when it does become co-opted, I think it comes across as inauthentic and actually delegitimizes the people that are co-opting and are trying to sort of make themselves relevant. So I think you'll always have a changing of guards, and this allows us to source where that idea came from initially. And then, you know, ideas always change. So I think, you know, the powers that be do so to be relevant, not because they themselves are originators of ideas. I think, if anything, the most relevant thing they can do is help spur original ideas from outside themselves. So I think this is a great technology in order to
It's a great point. Like, think about like royalty rights, and what actually goes into building a brand, building an artist, you know. And I think like now artists are starting to realize, hey, now I can have NFTs and share some of the value creation back to my original hardcore fans. Like, you know, they built me up, and I think it's a very fascinating new talk about mechanism design tour that you were talking about. It's like you're starting to see artists experiment with this model. It's like, okay, part of the NFT will have just codified component of it where I'm going to share part of the royalties with them. And the question is, well, why would you do that? Because it's like, well, you're going to expand the pie so much more when your audience, your fan base feels there's ownership and there's greater buy-in, right? When they feel like they're there. And right now you're using Twitter, for instance. I'm tweeting, I'm creating a certain amount of value because I have a certain amount of followers, and people gravitate to the platform because that's where I convey my ideas. As a small example, right? I'm no one in the scheme of like someone that has millions of followers. But now I think, like, when artists, content creators realize, wait a minute, I don't necessarily need to use YouTube, which extracts so much, 40% of what I make, or Sotheby's or Christie's. I can just use a decentralized platform that the power is back on me, and the discoverability element is back on me. Like, I don't need to go to Christie's to be a successful artist, or go to some of these creative agencies. Like, now you can connect directly with the fan base, and the fan base is really bought into this. And I think that idea alone is super powerful. And but yeah, I think we're probably just scratching the surface in terms of royalty rights, IP rights, that I think are going to fundamentally change because of this technology. You can actually now do some really interesting things from a mechanism perspective.
Funny enough, part of my MBA research was on precisely that, which was songwriter and production and performance rights management using blockchain for, and I wrote this in 2015. So basically I said, hopefully Colors Coins fixed it. And I may have been slightly early. But what can you do? Now we've got the NFT space. Now people are really figuring this stuff. There's some great music focused companies coming down the line dealing with this kind of stuff. I'm going to ask our final question, which is what we've got that time for, and then we're going to let you go. This has been a phenomenal first episode. Obviously, any of the topics that we've raised here, we could do standalone episodes on with you and with others. I mean, royalties itself is such a can of worms. There's no consensus in the space whatsoever as to the long-term future of royalties and how they should be enshrined. We haven't even touched on the legal implications for royalties, whether that's securitization, what the consequences is for collectors who are exposed to royalties. Put all that aside, like, I've just got one wrap-up question for you, which I think we'll come back to again and again as we do the Collectors series. But there's got to be so many things that in your position, since you've been early to so many things, I mean, you can always be earlier, right? But you've been there early for a lot of things. You've seen, and for things that worked and for things that didn't, right? We're always early to something. There's always some new trend coming. There's always something super exciting on the horizon. As a collector, you're always looking for what that could be, because either you're trying to preserve a piece of it for yourself or for the broader public, or you're trying to speculate on it, or you're trying, whatever you're trying to do. But it's nice to be early, and it's nice to educate others about that thing you see. Make seen the thing that without you might be unseen. So right now, as we wrap up, tell me, what is that trend? If you could pick one, what is that one thing you kind of see that you don't think other people have seen yet, but they're going to see? And when they do, they'll see the world a little bit more like you. Purely
Specifically on NFTs and collecting, or just crypto?
If you've got one for NFTs and collecting, that's great. Like, NFT trends are great, but if you've got even if you got an answer you're even more passionate about, I want to hear that.
Yeah, well, I think NFTs, I sort of alluded to this earlier on, which is, I think people don't realize how big and transformative NFTs will be. And it's just not, it's not art. It starts with art, but it certainly will not end there. And if you think about the implications of so many different challenges that haven't been solved in DeFi, like when you try to build an order book model or like an AMM for NFTs, like inherently there's less liquidity. There's just the matching algorithm. If you can solve, what I'm trying to say is, at the innovation level, some of the hardest problems, and I get excited when people are trying to solve them for NFTs, because if you can solve them for NFTs, inherently a non-fungible token, then you can do so many things and apply that to fungible tokens. And so you can transport a lot of that innovation to DeFi, for instance, and improve that like orders of magnitude. And so I think perhaps a big trend this year is bringing real world assets this idea of how can DAOs, how can this digital space interact in the real world? Because at some point, I think atoms will touch bits, and I think this space will really start permeating into traditional systems. And DAO space is really young, and probably many DAOs as they exist today are going to die or like really pivot because coordinating and is really hard. You have to build some hierarchy to operate. And so, yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is the biggest thing that I'm looking at is innovation in the NFT space. And also I get, art's great. I'm not like, I don't consider myself like an art connoisseur by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think that like early experiments, like why insure, like taking an insurance contract that was issued by Nexus Mutual for a specific wall and being able to fractionalize that, change that, and create just more efficiency in the way the cover was being priced, because you created a secondary market and effectively an oracle system to price cover. And basically you can then start creating a CDS market on top of that to like tell you how the market was perceiving, like how compound was riskier than Aave at any given moment in time. I just think these are just fascinating things that I will emerge over time. And so, yeah, I think the NFT space this is why you hear punks 6259 talk about like how NFTs are just going to be totally transformative. And I think in large part it's this idea that art is just a fraction of what is possible and will be possible with NFTs. And so very exciting.
It is. It really is. And I love that you're obviously very experienced in the DeFi space, an early investor in DeFi, now early to NFTs, now early to the next big thing. And I love how all of these are all part of the same sort of culture of experimentation, slapping culture and attaching it to these scarce items, but then also having DeFi and all of these complex interconnected protocols, all of this happening in an open, permissionless world. It's exciting to talk to you about it. It's exciting to think about it. It's exciting to build in that world. We're going to keep building in that world ourselves. Obviously, you will too. You're just going to keep collecting. I can't wait to see what you collect next. Before we sign off here, if people want to stay in touch with you, if they want to follow you, you mentioned you got a Twitter. What are the channels where they can keep up with you personally and learn more about how you collect? Yeah,
definitely. Twitter is where I like to keep the conversation open and public. And so Santiago R, and I also have a podcast too. So maybe we'll have to have you guys on talk about privacy in the NFT space. So it's called Empire, and I do it every week and been doing that for over a year now. And so yeah, those two are the best places.
We'd be delighted. And thanks again for coming on and being our inaugural guest. I can't imagine anybody else better to be kicking off all of these crazy conversations with. So can't wait for this to come out. Thanks everybody who's listening to the very first episode of the Collectors. Thanks to everybody who pre-minted this first episode of the Collectors. Stay tuned for the next one and the next one and the next one. On behalf of everybody here and MC, we're signing off as the Collectors. Thanks for hanging out with us, and Santi.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye. From the Collectors. Hosted by Stashh.